Okay, so this paper, I suppose, is my own attempt, I think, to intervene in what has, I think, been one of the major theoretical debates within cultural Marxism, and that is the relationship between Marxism and the literary movement broadly known as modernism. Now, the relationship between Marxism and modernism has had, let's say, a kind of checkered and contentious history. Marxist cultural criticism is often presented as being broadly divided into two camps. On the one side, you have a strident dismissal of modernism as a sign of bourgeois decadence, exemplified, I suppose, most infamously by the Soviet denunciation of James Joyce's Ulysses, the 1934 Soviet Writers' Congress, in which the doctrine of socialist realism was kind of enshrined. Radek stood up and denounced Ulysses as a heap of dung crawling with worms. And then on the other hand, you have George Lukács's critique, particularly of German expressionism, but also more broadly of that technique of stream of consciousness, which is one of the major techniques of modernism. So that's kind of one side of the argument. On the other hand, you have, I suppose, associated primarily with the Frankfurt School, and I suppose it has in many ways been the kind of the approach that a lot of Marxists have taken since, is that kind of enthusiastic embrace of modernism as an exemplary response to the condition of 20th century modernity. I suppose exemplified by Adorno's famous essay in 1963 on Samuel Beckett trying to understand Endgame. Now, obviously, the Soviet denunciation of Joyce and Adorno's embrace of Beckett do not represent the entire gamut of left-wing responses to modernism. They do, however, represent the rough contours of that response, and as such, I think, document a wider shift in Marxist responses to modernism from the 1920s to the 1990s. A shift, if you like, from hostile denunciation to an enthusiastic embrace as the most exemplary, radical form of art in modern times. Now, I think Ireland is an interesting case for discussions of modernism, because the country produced an extensive high modernist literature associated with Yeats in poetry, Joyce in the novel form, and Beckett in drama. But yet it doesn't conform to many of the more kind of classic conceptions of modernism, which associate the latter with European metropolis, new technologies, and radical revolution. And in many ways, while Beckett and Joyce are seen as quite central to the Marxist conception of modernism, they are often kind of presented, the fact that they're Irish is virtually ignored, and the fact that they have excelled as modernist artists is often seen, understood as something that happened in spite of their Irishness, rather than something that could perhaps in some way be explained from their country of origins. Ireland's colonial history provides a particular theoretical challenge to developing a kind of classical Marxist reading of modernism, because it's necessary to explain how Ireland developed by capitalist modernising processes that were quite different from the major metropolitan countries, while simultaneously allowing for the fact that its distinct development has always been shaped and conditioned by capitalist developments in these core areas. So, for much of the late 20th century, it has been conventional to describe modernism as an art of despair and pain, an art bred in the city where the scale of life diminishes the individual and where people live lives of disconnected bewilderment. The standard account of modernism argues that it is the art of the great urban capitals of Western Europe, Russia, or the United States, and the great literary, musical, cinematic, and visual experiments of the modernist avant-gardes that were viewed as attempts to give aesthetic expression to the kind of excitement and dissonance of modern urban and industrial life, that kind of, that Marx described so wonderfully in that very powerful passage in the Communist Manifesto, all that is solid melts into air. So modernism is seen in some way as the kind of aesthetic or cultural expression of that. This tendency to associate modernism with 20th century urban experience is fundamental to a number of the key 20th century theorists of modernism and modernity, including Georg Simmel, Walter Benjamin, and Louis Mumford. Many of modernism's most definitive texts, James Joyce's Ulysses, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, Alfred Dublin's Berlin Alexanderplatz, and Dos Passos, USA, explore the complexities of modern urban life. However, beginning in the late 1960s and late 1970s, a number of key figures in the Anglophone cultural left began critically to re-examine this assumption and to argue that modernism was best understood not just as a response to the social complexities and sensory peculiarities of urban life, but rather as an aesthetic revolution that needed to be explained with reference to a variety of other social phenomena, including the experience of cultural immigration and exile, the collisions between a declining aristocratic culture in Europe and the emergence of consumer society, and the wider cultural shifts brought about within the so-called West as a consequence of the crisis of European empire. So collectively or cumulatively, these interventions led to a reconceptualization of not only the social geography, but also the historical and temporal coordinates of modernism. The conceptual framework of modernism was widened, and modernist innovations in art were no longer conceived of as a response to specifically European or advanced capitalist conditions, but to a wider complex of changes that were essentially global in scale. So crucially, modernism was viewed not just as a response to the shock of the new, where the new is defined in terms of European technological innovations, changing urban landscapes, or the kind of sensory stimuli of the great Western metropolis, but to the clash between the modern and the pre-modern or non-modern, and conceived now in terms of a broader international or transnational context. This shift in conceptualization of modernism, I think, is best summarized by the Marxist cultural and literary critic Frederick Jameson, who argues that modernism is a cultural mode that emerges at a later moment when capitalism dramatically extends its global reach via imperialism, but when nonetheless, quote, the technologically or socially modern was still little more than an enclave, in which the country still coexists with the city and still largely outweighs it. In other words, modernism is a term that designates the matrix of possible aesthetic responses to that capitalist moment that is defined between, if you like, the clash of the old and the new. And it corresponds to the lived experience of uneven temporalities, of what Ernest Bloch describes as simultaneous non-simultaneity. This perspective found its most sustained theoretical expression in Perry Anderson's 1984 essay, Modernity and Revolution. Anderson, I suppose, in many ways is kind of glossing Trotsky's theory of combined and uneven development, although he doesn't actually explicitly acknowledge this. Anderson argues for a conjunctural explanation of the wide variety of aesthetic practices and ideas known as modernism. Conjuncture is a term that denotes the exact balance or configuration of forces and the overdetermination of the contradictions that obtain within that balance that can be said to constitute a particular historical moment. So for Anderson, it is significant that the most extensive European modernist movements emerged in the early 20th century, not in the most industrial, advanced, or the most modern country of the time, England, but rather where complex conjunctures allowed for the intersection of different and historical temporalities. So this is problem in one sense is that modernism is an art form that is associated with advanced capitalist development, most particularly in the kind of urban centres, but yet it doesn't really flourish in those centres. The most exciting modernist innovations often come from kind of peripheral countries, and even where they do in kind of urban centres, it's often the writers and artists who create this modernist art are often from kind of rural areas who actually come into these urban centres. So how do you explain that in Marxist terms? And this is what Anderson is trying to do. So he argues for, he's got a kind of a kind of what he calls a kind of triangular explanation, which has three coordinates. The first was the codification of a highly formalized academicism in the visual and other arts that drilled students in the major styles and masterpieces of the classical or neoclassical past. So particularly in Europe, in kind of Paris, Germany, Berlin, Vienna, there were these kind of academies that functioned, if you like, as the kind of great cultural gatekeepers of states that were still massively dominated by aristocratic or landowning classes, which, though economically, in relative terms, were still setting, even though they were sort of declining economically, they were still setting, if you like, the kind of political and cultural tone in the European countries before and even to some extent after World War I. The second coordinate is this idea that in these kind of largely in these kind of societies that you had the development of key technologies that are associated, if you like, with the kind of what is referred to as the kind of second industrial revolution. The chemical and synthetic industries, electric power, turbines, internal combustion engines, the telephone, radio, cinema, the automobile, the aircraft. So you have the development of these kind of great great advances in technology and the industries associated with them. And thirdly, I suppose this is the most decisive coordinate, and that is the imaginative proximity of social revolution in these countries. In no European country at the start of the 20th century was bourgeois democracy completed in the sense, and I mean that in the sense that adult suffrage was extended to all. In lots of countries, women didn't have the vote, and often many workers didn't have the vote. And there was still quite a radical and insurgent labour movement that still remained largely outside the political system and had yet to be kind of co-opted as a political force. The extent of hope or apprehension about revolution varied widely across Europe, but it was everywhere in the air, and especially, I suppose, after the Russian Revolution in 1917. So across Europe, then, the old order still clung tenaciously in both the political and cultural sphere, but it was everywhere shadowed not only by the sweeping changes triggered by the still infant Second Industrial Revolution, but also, crucially, by the spectre of political revolution. And hence that moment was pervaded by a sense that the future was something that was radically open-ended. Anderson's thesis, then, is that modernism arose at the intersection between a semi-aristocratic order, a semi-industrialised capitalist economy, and within a context in which there was a sense of the imaginative and transforming possibilities of political revolution. So I suppose the question, therefore, in light of this, is how does this help us to explain the emergence of modernism in Ireland? The historical schemas that are often used to explain this, associated, I suppose, with Lukács or Ernest Mandel or Frederick Jameson, can't easily be transposed onto the Irish situation. Firstly, most of the leading Marxist cultural histories are elaborated within a kind of metropolitan European or Euro-American capitalist, are elaborated with a metropolitan European or Euro-American capitalist history in mind. Lukács's work takes its bearings primarily from French and German, and to a lesser extent English and Russian literary history. Jameson addresses himself to the continental Western Europe, England, France, Germany, and the US, although his later work does extend that frame a little. But from well before the modern period, however, Irish history had evolved in ways that did not conform in some decisive respects to the developments in metropolitan cultures that inform Lukács and Jameson's work. Secondly, these Marxist modes of history often assume as normative the transition from feudalism via absolutism to mercantile and later industrial capitalism, or as a series of kind of structural modulations within capitalism, something like what's described by Ernest Mandel. Irish history, on the other hand, doesn't really neatly fit in to any of these kind of Marxist schemas. To take a particularly vivid example, when mid-19th century English capitalist development issued in the Industrial Revolution that made Britain the workshop of the world, Ireland was devastated by the social catastrophe of the famine. So while in one society, in other words, was being transformed by developments that would bring it to the height of its industrial and imperial glory. The other was almost being destroyed by what Mike Davis would call a mid-Victorian Holocaust. So for much of European modernity, that was synonymous with the assumption of key structural positions in the emerging structural worlds, the accumulation of wealth, monopolization of the means of violence, national aggrandizement, and a sense of cultural distinction that attended this. Ireland, in contrast, had a very different experience of modernity. In Ireland, modernity meant dispossession, subordination, the loss of sovereignty, the collapse of its indigenous social order, and the gradual disintegration of the Gaelic cultural system, and successive waves of political or economically enforced emigration. So capitalist modernity in Ireland, in other words, advanced within a colonial regime under which the country remained the most chronically unstable and rebellious location within the British arpeggio from the early modern period until the later 20th century. So, and I think this is the important point. Nevertheless, while this massive discrepancy in national experience certainly speaks for itself, I think the challenge facing Marxists posed by these kind of concurrent developments is to conceive of them not as two altogether alien and disjunctive histories, but rather as two divergent vectors of the same process. So the particular theoretical challenge of the Irish situation is to be able to deal with the ways in which the country has developed by capitalist modernising processes that were quite different from those in the major metropolitan European and American countries, while simultaneously allowing for the fact that its distinct development has always been shaped and conditioned by capitalist developments in these core areas. So in other words, I suppose the challenge for Marxists is to steer a course, if you like, between a perspective that would simply stress Ireland's sameness to the metropolitan states, the kind of argument often that the kind of revisionists make, Roy Foster and co., thereby effacing differences and to press Ireland into a kind of standard metropolitan template, and one that would stress only its fundamental, its exceptional, or the aberrant elements to the metropolitan centres, which I think is sometimes how post-colonial studies presents it. So to say that Ireland's condition has been one of core peripherality is not to suggest that it developed somewhere entirely beyond the pale of metropolitan modernity. On the contrary, if you like, to be peripheral is precisely to be compelled to develop within the constraints, the sets of forces and the agendas, economic, political, cultural, intellectual, that have largely been prescribed or conditioned by developments in the metropolis. To think beyond cultural orthodoxy in Irish social and cultural history usually construes Ireland as only kind of badly or belatedly catching up with the model of modernisation that had been kind of immaculately completed much earlier in Europe. But I think we need to look for a less kind of linear and more global, conjunctural, or indeed dialectical analysis that starts from the assumptions that Irish modernity comprises a particular configuration of wider global processes. So I want to briefly just conclude by arguing that this Marxist perspective on Irish modernism, I think, can provide an illuminating explanation for the kind of linguistic eccentricity and the kind of peculiar mix of radicalism and conservatism that characterises Irish modernism. So Terry Eagleton, in his quite important essay, The Archaic Avant-Garde, which is in that collection, Heathcliff and the Great Hunger, he argues that the Ireland of the late 19th century and early 20th century was every bit as much as of a capitalist formation as its British counterparts, but that the Irish variety was, quote, a woefully inert form of rural capitalism, an old-fashioned form of modernity. Moreover, he goes on to argue that the prime mover of modernisation in Ireland was the rural middle classes, what he calls one of the most conservative formations in Western Europe, and that the class lacked the challenge of an industrial working class to spur it into life. There could be, he concludes, no exhilarating encounter between art and technology in such an industrially backward country. Now, well, I think this is certainly Eagleton's essay is very, very important in that kind of reconceptualizing of modernism that a lot of Marxist critics have played an important role in. I think, nevertheless, Eagleton does seem just kind of assume a too automatic or unmediated connection between economic base and culture. As Anderson points out, it was precisely in the least industrially advanced European societies, namely Italy and Russia, that the most militant, anti-traditionalist, modernist movements emerged, as are exemplified by the Italian futurists and the Russian constructivists. But the question is, I suppose, why did something like this not occur in Ireland? The answer, I think, surely has to do not just with the rural middle classes per se, but with the experience of Irish colonial history, which had simultaneously transferred most of the Irish working class abroad. For example, by the 1860s, New York had a larger Irish population than Dublin. And it rendered the industrial northeast the most determinantly reactionary region in the entire island. In Ireland, the most industrialised enclave in the northeast and the most substantial industrial working class were peculiarly aligned with the forces of British imperial tradition and counter-revolution, and as a result did not produce a cultural modernist efflorescence of the kind that issued from other European industrial enclaves also enclosed within these kind of largely agrarian societies. And I think the most comparable model would be probably with Italy. It's also true that the technological advances of the Second Industrial Revolution only lightly affected the Ireland of Ireland as a whole. In the Irish situation, the kind of bewildering force that Anderson ascribes to the kind of technological revolution had already been affected instead by a very different route, and that is by the devastation of the Irish famine. The effect of the second industrial revolution in Europe, as Anderson and others have suggested, was to corrode the old social order, dissolving its pre-capitalist elements, imploding traditional forms of everyday life, and installing in their place new work practices, new modes of transport and communication, new kinds of social space, and new gender relations. The Irish critic Joe Cleary has argued that decades before the Second Industrial Revolution and the Great War did their work in continental Europe, the famine in Ireland had arguably represented a merciless and accelerated convulsion of this magnitude, decimating the subaltern classes, accelerating the exodus from the land to the core industrial centres of England and America, and compelling a shift to a very different new property regimes at home, and not least dealing the final death blow to Gaelic culture. I suppose what the peculiar, I suppose, in other words, I suppose just to put it quite simply, the futurists might have felt that Italy was smouldering under the excessive encumbrance of their once glorious heritage, and one of the things the futurists were trying to do was shake off what they felt was the kind of oppressive sense of imperial Rome and the Renaissance. But for Ireland, the real dilemma was not so much of a native heritage that had disappeared. The problem for Ireland was that native culture was not something that was oppressive, but was something that had been, if you like, destroyed. So, in other words, as Joe Cleary suggests, the whole drive of, if you like, the revival, which I think rather than being seen as kind of counterposed, as it often is in cultural studies, to kind of the modernism, you know, Yeats versus Joyce, if you like, that is part of the same process. And because our Irish native culture had been destroyed, there was it was part of a kind of, at times, quite progressive political project to kind of to rehabilitate that. And I think as well, just referring back again to kind of Eagleton's argument that there was something kind of quite regressive about Irish modernism, ignores the fact that the city and the machine and an embrace of technology is no guarantee of a progressive art or politics either. The Italian futurists, to cite an obvious example, embraced that great brave new world of the 20th century with a kind of missionary zeal. But while the futurists attacked the monarchy and the Vatican, They also denigrated Parliament and socialism and trusted extreme Italian nationalism and imperialism and war to kind of blast their way to the future. So just finally, when Eagleton concludes then that what is striking about Irish modernism is its overwhelming conservative tenor, arguing that the country is too rural and too technologically backward to produce this radical avant-garde on the continental European model. I think what he's ignoring is the fact that Ireland nonetheless produces several great modernist writers. First Thing and Yeats, then Joyce and later Beckett, who were all in different ways trying to struggle with that kind of clash between the modern and the pre-modern. And I suppose finally, while Irish writers produced several of the most challenging masterpieces, literary masterpieces, the country didn't produce an extended modernist culture. And I think this was not because Ireland was pre-modern or a kind of traditional rural backwater, but because I think you could argue that in some ways, in a kind of socio-historical sense, it was too modern, since it had been via colonialism kind of capitulated directly into modernity without ever have kind of passing through feudalism in the kind of classic or strictly normative sense of the word.